Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the inaugural Rocky Mountain Conference on Defense and Security, a periodic virtual speaker series through which our members and guests are able to attend thought-provoking and forward-looking presentations by leaders in Canada's defense and security community. This is a RAUSI, or Royal Alberta United Services Institute initiative. My name is Paul Bury, Chair of the RAUSI Programs Committee and your host for tonight's event. RAUSI is a Canadian-based forum for global civilians, humanitarians, members of the military, and international police communities to present original thought pieces on trending topics as they relate to global security and defense. Formed in 1920 as a think tank, RAUSI later evolved into a service organization for veterans in the decades following the Second World War. Several years ago, the RAUSI Board of Directors made a decision to go back to their roots, as it were, back to providing their members and guests forward-looking, thought-provoking, original content, curated topical articles, and sponsoring speakers' symposia, which amplify cross-disciplinary models of 21st century security and defense. Tonight's speaker is a great friend to many of us attending tonight. Dr. Joseph Howard serves on the RAUSI Board of Directors, where his varied skills are regularly called upon. Dr. Howard's credentials lie in the international law, geopolitical analysis, and complex emergencies. A former Canadian armored officer and a chartered accountant, he currently consults widely across the globe. He has civilian and military expertise in Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. At the UN headquarters in New York, in Ottawa, National Defense Headquarters in the J3 International Shop, and in the field with DPKO, NATO, and the United States Department of Defense. He has specific interests in security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, civil-military relations, policy design and evaluation, and, of course, operational planning. He holds a PhD and an LLM in international law, a master's degree in international studies and diplomacy. In his spare time, he attended training at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. Tonight, Dr. Howard shares his thoughts regarding the security and defense. Are they too often and incorrectly conflated as one model? After the prepared video, Dr. Howard will join us on the call to engage in further discussion. Now, I know we're all looking forward to hearing Dr. Howard's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joe Howard.
Hello, my name is Joe Howard. Thank you very much for showing up to this presentation. It's the first in a series of presentations being offered by the Royal Alberta United Services Institute. The Institute is trying to develop a parallel track of presentations. One track is military history. The other track is security and defense. And I think if you take them together, you're going to find that we're covering the entire context in terms of time and substance. So with that in mind, let's cut to the chase and let me put to you a hypothesis, which is why you're here tonight, or why we're here tonight. And the hypothesis is that security and defense are very often and too often conflated into one model. And I think that is incorrect. The second part of the hypothesis is that security is that structure of systems, processes, policies, and practices that drive security outputs. Whereas defense is that structure of processes, systems, policies, and practices that protect security. So the two are separate. The two are certainly linked. There is what the academics would call a symbiotic relationship between the two. But one needs the other. But I'm noting that a disproportionate amount of time is spent singularly on defense. So this evening, I want to test the hypothesis. I've laid out the hypothesis, and what we're going to do is break down what's in security, break down what's in defense, and identify what is the link between the two. And I'll give you a warning right now. This whole hypothesis can be tested in terms of economics, sociology, history, for all I know. But I want to look at it in terms of international law because that's what my strength is. So with that caveat in mind, let's look at what security is. And I'm going to suggest to you that security outputs are such things as the efficient flow of financial capital, an efficient flow of intellectual capital. It is a regime of environmental health, and I'm not talking just about physical environment, but a mental and sociological environment that allows for fulsome education and decent housing. Another output is going to be regimes of human rights. And if we look at those outputs and look at them in the longer term, let's look at some of the outcomes. And I will suggest to you that the outcomes are creation of financial wealth, creation of intellectual wealth, an establishment of human rights, and the ability to identify threats to this whole security apparatus. So let's move on to where does this security apparatus come from? Well, it comes from, I'm going to suggest, at least 5 institutions. Collective security regimes. And we're thinking of institutions such as the United Nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the OSCE, and the OECD. All these organizations which produce those kinds of outputs. We're also talking about global administrative law. Global administrative law is that body of regulations which fill the gaps between international treaties. Treaties set out broad principles, but in the executables, there are gaps which global administrative law fills. Can you think of organizations like the International Maritime Organization? It's responsible for the efficient shipping, safe shipping, flagging of ships. All that is governed by global administrative law. Similarly, the World Trade Organization, anti-dumping duties, what constitutes source of origin rules. All those kinds of things are covered by global administrative law. Intergovernmental organizations, Financial Action Task Force, designed to prevent the laundering of money. Another source of these security outputs and outcomes is the body of transnational organizations. Transnational organizations may have started back in the 1860s, but with globalized society, they have certainly come a very long way. These are organizations which operate without regard to borders. They're value-driven organizations, usually pursuing one agenda. And they are very effective in advancing the debate on those outputs and outcomes. We're thinking of organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. The last source of this security structure is the body of international law, those organs which advance and adjudicate international law. And we're talking about organizations such as the International Court of Justice, Permanent Court of Arbitration, the International Criminal Court, as well as regional courts such as the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. So having established how this security apparatus has arrived, we just have to start linking it to one more step, and that is the collective security regime. And that step is to understand that the fulcrum, the pivot point of all this is the international order comprised of states. And if we do not have states, then this whole debate disappears. States are the product of, among other things, the Montevideo Treaty of 1934, I believe, which sets out that for a state to exist, it has to have territory, population, governance, the ability to engage in international obligations, and recognition. So, let me put this to you. Is Taiwan a state? Taiwan is topical these days, but it is only recognized by, I believe, 16 or so other states. So the whole concept of security rests in turn on the international order. Moving along from global security to collective security, we're looking at the one instrument which enables collective defense, and that's where the linkage is between security and defense. The UN Charter sets out very clearly in Article 2.4, force cannot be used to settle international disputes, but there are two exceptions. Number one, Article 51, which says a state may use force if there is imminent threat. The second, states can form a collective defense regime, such as NATO. There's one more element in this charter that's worth pointing out, and that is Chapter 7, Articles 39 and 41, I believe, which allows the Security Council, but only the Security Council, to identify a threat to or a breach of the peace, in which case the Security Council can decide that the international community will use force or threat of force to address that threat to peace or breach of the peace. So with that in mind, let's move over to what is collective defense. We noted that Article 51 allows collective defense organizations to use force should there be an imminent threat. NATO is one such organization. The Collective Security Treaty Organization is another. The Inter-American Reciprocal Treaty Assistance Organization is a third. And the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was a fourth until it was wound up in 1977. So beyond collective defense is national defense. And most of us are familiar with the NSA, the CIA, in Canada, CSIS and CSE, and in the UK, MI6, MI5, and GCHQ. And lastly, the national uniformed defense establishments. And those are what are most visible to us, and that seems to be the element of this whole debate which commands a disproportionate amount of time. And that's what's bothering me. We can talk about a regiment or a battalion, but what about the rest of the debate? And if you don't take in the big picture, we're going to lose. So a couple of takeaways. Number one, the center of gravity in this whole thing is the confidence of the public in the system to develop, to produce those security outputs and security outcomes. Second takeaway, if this debate isn't going to happen, that confidence can't exist. That confidence only arises because we're talking about it. And lastly, this whole model rests on the body of international law. It's that law which creates the states, which creates outputs. And without international law, none of this is going to happen. Whether that law is effective or not is a different story. A story I hope we can have in the future. Thank you very much for your time. Look forward to discussions. See you later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard, for that presentation. I would like now to ask Dr. Howard if you would like to make any amplifying comments or elaborate on any point in the video prior to taking questions from the audience.
Thanks, Paul, for those comments. And the first rule of engagement is call me Joe. Otherwise, I expect you want something from me. I'd like to just extend the discussion, if I can, for a couple of minutes into the present day context. The Russia-Ukraine situation is commanding a lot of time. And as Paul asked me earlier today, the comments that I made in the presentation may reflect a Western perspective. And that's probably right, because I'm Western and that's my area of expertise. But if we were sitting in Moscow, or for that matter, Beijing, would this same presentation evolve? Stated another way, what constitutes security in Russia? And what constitutes security in China? Well, if we flip back to the Russia-Ukraine situation, put yourself in the situation of a citizen in one of the EU states. And instead of talking about efficient flows of financial capital or intellectual capital, let's drill down a bit and talk about the effective flow of energy capital. Russia commands either the second or third largest reserves of hydrocarbons, and it has huge gas fields out in middle to east central Russia. And that gas is flowing through any number of pipelines, the Nord Stream pipeline, the Blue pipeline, the Turk pipeline, down to Turkey and to various parts of continental Europe. So security in the shorter term may mean the ability to heat your home, the ability to run your factories. And it brings into question, how is that going to demand a defense posture? And defense may not necessarily mean any one of those institutions, but how does European demand for gas, or the lack of demand, or the withdrawal of demand of Russian gas act as a defense posture? There's no right answer, but I wanted to bring this security and defense debate into something a little bit more concrete. And I can tell you that in the European gas markets, this is a huge issue as to who is going to buy Russian gas, who is not going to buy Russian gas, and what is Russia going to do if nobody buys its gas. So with that in mind, I'll just throw the question back at the audience and hope that we can engage in some really robust discussion. I'll tell you right now, I don't have the right answer, but I think our discussions might be able to produce some really cool answers. So with that in mind, I'm open for questions.
I've got a question. First of all, thanks for doing this, Joe. I thought it was really good and I really enjoyed it. That was very succinct and that was good. Well done. My question is, you said the center of gravity is public confidence. How has our Western security diminished in light of the loss of public confidence in governments at all levels, and especially in the US, where it seems like they have lost their confidence through the last 5 years in terms of leadership and on the world stage?
First point where that confidence is directed is at governments, but as you say, that has been dissipated. It may be that confidence has been redirected more into non-governmental institutions. It's been confidence in financial markets, financial and intellectual capital markets. But then your rebuttal may be, well then where does that leave the government? And that the answer to that may be, it leaves the government as regulators of those markets. So instead of the public having confidence in the government, it has confidence in various institutions, and it's the government who will regulate those institutions. So the line, if you will, from the public in terms of confidence goes to private sector elements and transnational sector elements. I may have more faith in Human Rights Watch to bring human rights violations to the fore than I do in the Department of XYZ, in the Department of Justice. I may have more confidence. If I were a citizen in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I might have more confidence in the International Criminal Court to prosecute human rights violations than I do in the Department of Justice of the government of the DRC. So that line of confidence is perhaps its trajectory and aiming point is shifting away from what you and I know as government, which isn't to say government's not as strong as it is, but it may not be as effective. Have I gone any way in answering your question?
Yes, that's good, Joe. Thank you very much.
Yep. Good question.
Thank you. I'll do a short introduction. I'm an interloper here that's not connected in with this group before. So I'm a defense academic working internally within national defense, spent 33 years in uniform and working on some of the issues that are directly related. Joe, I very much appreciated your presentation and the framework you put forward. I'll park following up on Doug's question, because my quick comment is I think some of the Pew research shows that Americans have lost confidence in pretty well everything, which is, and I think, well, and I think, as we know, that this has not been accidental. This has been influenced by international intrusions into American debates and affairs. However, I'll park that. The question I was going to ask with this is, in your conceptualization of security and defense, how do you consider the concept of human security, and that it kind of waxes and wanes? It's been an issue of interest. Canada got enthusiastic about it, and then we dropped off. The UN has gotten enthusiastic more recently on using human security. NATO is now talking about developing policies on human security. So how do you see that fitting into your framework and the way you think of these things?
Thanks for the question. I have not thought of human security per se, but now that you put the question to me, I'd say human security is manifest in any number of those security outputs. It's a secure financial flow. It's a secure flow of intellectual capital, education, housing, all those. Human security by itself, respectfully, may be a concept, but if you're going to execute, you have to execute within one of the streams, and that's how I would frame human security. And if I were a policymaker, that's where I would have to go to execute. As a NATO minister or UN delegate, I just can't say hand on heart human security. I got to say, here's a policy, here's a program, now let's go execute, and then let's assess. Does that fill the gap in your question at all?
It does, and I may, outside of this session, I may want to follow up with you if I can, if we could perhaps have a follow-on conversation on this. Yeah.
I will track you down if you don't track me down. That's the promise.
Excellent.
You know Doug?
Yeah, so I believe so. so
well,
Doug, who was
good.
on, yeah, okay.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Alan, with your permission, I can share your email address with Joe after the meeting.
Certainly, thank you.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Al.
Karen, please go ahead with your question.
Joe, I understand that within collective defense treaties like NATO, that there is an obligation under Article 5 that if one country is attacked, all countries are attacked and must come to the defense of that country. And I'm just wondering if there's any kind of international law that protects countries or that may give them the right to protection from other collectives if they are being threatened. And I'm thinking of Afghanistan, where the international community really turned its back on Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, is there anything in international law that that collectively we should have helped them through their crisis in the summer? I'm thinking about the Ukraine. I know that they are not a part of NATO and would like to be for that very reason. And what about Taiwan? I mean, where does the international community draw the line? If we let Afghanistan go, do we let Taiwan go? Do we let the Ukraine go?
There are a couple of dimensions to your question, I think, Karen. And as soon as you spoke of Afghanistan, what came to mind was responsibility to protect. You may recall in the high-level panel of 2004, Kofi Annan, that assessed the threats to global security. They introduced the concept of responsibility to protect, and that gained a lot of momentum, certainly within the transnational community and at the political level. But as you might guess, executing was a failure. And I think that failure arose because of a lack of connectivity between, on the one hand, Canada's national interest, for example, and Afghan national interest. There has to be a connectivity of national interests. There may be a far firmer connectivity of national values, but we have to distinguish between national values and national interests. Values are those long-standing values that persist over decades and over centuries. We're thinking of Canada such as peace, order, and good government. But when it gets down to the nitty-gritty in Cabinet caucus, what are the national interests that are going to be served by assisting states in difficulty? Why has Canada not offered weapons to the Ukraine? And the loan is forgivable. What that's telegraphing is that Canada's national interests concerning the Ukraine are in fact truncated, as they were with Afghanistan, and likewise with Taiwan. There is a bilateral defense treaty between Taiwan and the United States, and there may be one between Japan, but there's certainly no collective defense treaty that will assist Taiwan. And as the presentation noted, Taiwan's only recognized by 16 states formally. So if one expects a state to assist Taiwan in its time of need, that is a huge stretch of national interests, and they're not there. What are the national interests that any state has in Taiwan? The one that does come to mind is semiconductor industry, because Taiwan accounts for a huge portion of the production of semiconductors. And that's pretty micro, you got to admit, but that's a real national interest. Other than that, the interests aren't there. The commonality of interest isn't there.
Joe, what about a strategic interest in terms of controlling the South China Seas, or a strategic interest in not having China control Taiwan? Is there anything that, does that relate to national interest?
It does, because the national interest becomes freedom of shipping. And that's why there are institutions such as the Quad, made up of Japan, US, Australia, and I believe India, that are exercising in the South China Sea. But what they're doing is they're not there to protect Taiwan. They're there to protect their own respective shipping interests through the Straits of Taiwan. And likewise, if you extend that northeast to the Arctic region, that'll be the same phenomenon. What they're allowed to protect under the international law is freedom of shipping. Does that help at all?
Yes, in fact, that was going to be my next question. Are they allowed under international law to protect their interests in free shipping?
Well, they are, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. That's great that you and I can agree on freedom of shipping, but how do you defend freedom of shipping? And I guess you have to drill down deeper. ships are sovereign property. So if a bad guy attacks a Canadian ship, that is attack on the sovereign property of Canada. Canada is then entitled to use force to defend itself. But just being able to say I can or cannot sail up and down the Taiwan Straits by itself, it's a nice thing to do. But again, I want to see a couple of people going at it. And only then can I think can international law really speak to the issue in concrete terms. In other words, you got to wait for a spitting contest, Karen, and then we'll test your hypothesis.
Right. Well, it looks like we may have a spitting contest with Russia and Ukraine. What do you think?
Well, if there is to be a threat or use of force, I'm going to go back to my flow of financial capital. What is going to be the hit on foreign currency that Russia will earn from the sale of hydrocarbons? 60% of the Russian economy is dependent on energy. That's a lot. And if the continental Europe can get its energy supplies from other sources, then there is a currency loss. But Karen, that changes the direction of the debate from national interest to national values. And we get into this whole question, and maybe next month's speaker will address it, is what is driving Russia's interest in the Ukraine? And it may be that there is an existential threat that Russia has faced ever since the Mongols invaded it in 1333 or whenever it was. Russia has very few natural borders, and its national defense posture is to defend its borders by aggressively looking for and preempting threats, which may not exist.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, if Russia, because it's all about perspective, with international law, Russia may feel perfectly justified in reclaiming it, what it considers to be its territory. And so then international law becomes tricky because doesn't seem like there's any hierarching body of authorities to determine whose perspective is actually correct with international law. I guess it's a matter of duking it out to find out whose perspective is correct.
Well, good question. The answer is that in the statute of the International Court of Justice, Article 36 sets out something called consent jurisdiction, which translated into English means that if Russia and the Ukraine both agree that the dispute will be settled at the International Court of Justice, then the ICJ's decision prevails. So that is the person who's going to trump that little spitting contest, or adjudicate that little spitting contest you talked about. But both parties have to agree. And if they do agree, then they are in effect surrendering that sliver of sovereignty to a higher authority. But they're only doing it because they consent to it. I'm sure you're intimately familiar with Article 36 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice. I don't have to tell you, Karen. But when you read it again tonight, you'll see the word consent. So it comes back to the principle of sovereignty, which is the first general principle of law. States are allowed to do whatever they have to do to preserve their sovereignty. So your question is going to be, is Ukraine the sovereign territory of Russia? Well, Stalin did not think so, but Putin does think so. So here we have this now cult of personality entering the debate. This is not Russia, this is Vladimir Putin. But if you roll the clock back 70 years to Joseph Stalin, we might not be having this issue. But Stalin is an expansionist. He arguably wants to reclaim the Baltic states, Finland, as well as the former Soviet Union, the collapse of which he said was one of the world's greatest geopolitical catastrophes, which I think is incorrect. The bigger catastrophe was the World War I, which begat World War II, which begat the USSR. And only the collapse of the USSR that should be put into perspective. Anyway, I'm ranting.
That's good. Thanks, Joe.
Does the Ukraine have a collective security agreement with anyone?
Short answer, I don't know. Longer answer, I doubt it. Because if they did, they would have invoked it by now. Now, do they have a bilateral agreement with anybody? I don't know, but if they did, they'd invoke it. But maybe the follow-on question is, can the Ukraine enjoy the benefits through other diplomatic means besides a collective security, a collective defense treaty? I don't know, it's a rhetorical question, but there may be other means to enjoy the benefits that would derive from a collective defense treaty.
International law?
How will international law affect the relationship that the Ukraine may have with another party? And the answer is it does through the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Articles 33 to 6 just set out that how treaties are interpreted will determine whether or not the treaty is operable. So if the Ukraine's got a treaty with another country, both countries have to agree on how that particular clause will be interpreted, and then that's all you need. So to answer your question, international law will provide for the Ukraine to enjoy benefits from any kind of treaty with any other sovereign state.
Yeah, thanks very much. Joe, I just want to come back to your discussion about collective defense, and I'm going to use NATO as a specific example. Within NATO, there is significant debate about what that means. So, for example, nations like Italy and Spain feel that the main threat is coming from the migrant crisis to the south. Countries such as Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia feel that their main threat is from the east, from Russia. So within that one body, you have a significant tug between differing perspectives and in security and defense. And I'm wondering if in your research and your readings, if you have thought of perhaps a way to move beyond that, or are we always going to be dealing with regional issues within a collective body such as NATO? Thanks.
The latter is true. It will occur in, I believe, any collective organization. The EU is another great example where there are regional factions and conflicting interests. But let's accelerate your question to where either or both those threats materialize into what, from the Caroline case, becomes a imminent threat. And that is a real threat to which there is no time to develop a more diplomatic response, but instead a manifest threat or use of force is justified in international law. But I can understand the migrant threat. It is a threat to security systems and to human security systems, which was mentioned above. And the threat for the Baltic states coming from the, get my directions, from the east, I guess, perhaps more a territorial issue, and the reclamation of the former Russian empire, which Putin wants to advance. The thing is, if you're the Secretary General and you're at the NAC, and how do you reconcile those two differences? Whose interests, or which threat comes first? And I guess that comes down to a threat analysis, and are there other ways to mitigate the threats? It may be more difficult to mitigate the threat of territorial incursion in the Baltic states, but with enough money, education, and diplomacy, the threat from migrants may be more easily mitigated. I know a classmate of mine from China is now working in the German Foreign Ministry, And her job is to deal with the migrants that are, at least were, coming up through Greece. And she told me a couple of years ago, you know, it's all diplomacy and it's all the invocation of the, what's in part, the invocation of the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm not a human rights lawyer, but as I understand it, once you put your foot on sovereign soil of the EU, you're entitled to protection under the European Convention on Human Rights. And if you're a policymaker, you may say, well, that's it. I can't do anything more. They're protected. It's not my problem as defense minister. It's now the problem for the Minister of Culture, the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Housing. Does that help at all, Paul?
Yeah, it's great. Thanks.
It's pragmatic. Is Tony Jules online? Tony, are you here?
I am here, my lord.
You've spent, thank you. That's good news, Tony. You spent time in the East, a lot of time in the East. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on what constitutes security in the East. You got a lot more time there than I do, but I'm thinking of the role of the Communist Party of China. That is a security instrument. If you believe in the Communist Party of China and its doctrines, then that is the confidence. That is the confidence of the public, which is that center of gravity, at least that I suggested, makes this system work. Can you see defining security differently if we were having this debate in Beijing or Hong Kong?
Well, I think we can draw interesting parallels between China and Russia at the moment, because internal dissent can be matched by finding the common enemy outside. And in the case of Ukraine, Putin is facing quite severe internal, not unrest at present, but certainly anxiousness amongst the population. And whereas in China, we know that dissent is put down quite violently and vigorously. So in the case of Russia, it's Ukraine. You want to focus a portion of the community on the outside perceived threat. In the case of China, of course, it's Taiwan, taking back part of the motherland, which is Taiwan, to which rebels fled in 1949 and have held out ever since. I think that's how they view it.
Well, is the Ukraine seen as the enemy?
Not as the enemy, though, but we've got building blocks here. We've got the Crimea, which was Russian in the first instance, I understand. We've got Donetsk, where there was there's been a 7-year war there. Large indigenous and Russian population, I gather, in the northern stretches of the Donetsk.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking back to a little bit of time in China and the concept of Confucianism, or the belief of the writings of Confucius, and that it is a very hierarchical society, whereas out here in the West, it is relatively flat. And in China, the first rule of engagement is know your place, but that's foreign to us here in the West. So when we start identifying themes of security outputs and outcomes, how those are defined and who is defining them are quite different. So bringing to the fore the old rule, know who you're doing business with. Interesting. Anyway, thanks, Tony. So,
very good. Thank you, Dr. Howard.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a written question.
Oh, we have a written question. Stand by.
I could read it.
Does the UN not give Ukraine some protection from Russian aggression? And also, wasn't there a security threat or agreement and a commitment from Russia to respect the borders of the Ukraine and other breakaway states? Thanks for the question. There was, at the time of the breakup of the USSR in 1989, there was a treaty whose name I can't remember, but as I recall, that treaty, in essence, recognized the sovereign state of the Ukraine and other former members of the USSR. But that was done before Mr. Putin assumed power. That was done at the very moment that the USSR was collapsing. So at that moment, Ukraine gained it or regained its sovereign state, its status as a sovereign state. So the UN Charter, which is I think what the question probably refers to, the UN Charter will say we have two sources of international law. We have treaty law and we have customary practice. And customary practice and treaty law are then followed by general principles. And as I mentioned before, the first general principle is the principle of sovereignty. And so if sovereignty is assigned to the state of Ukraine in 1989, it's very difficult to retract that sovereignty unilaterally by another state. But as Stephen Kagan, who's an academic down in the States, he wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs in 2017. He identifies Putin as a sort of a cult of personality. And personality is trumping international law. You might say the same thing about China, Xi Jinping, and Taiwan. But Tony Jules, I hope, may either correct me or tell me I'm right, that the claim of China to Taiwan has got some historical basis to it. But the claim of Russia to Ukraine has less historical basis. Taiwan was, for a very short period of time, recognized as a state, relatively shorter than that of the Ukraine. So to answer your question, the UN Charter provides for the body of international law, actually through the statute of the court, and that law assigns sovereign states their preeminence as a sovereign state and at the top end of the international order. Stand by, there's a supplemental written question. The international order depends on the respective treaties, correct? Doesn't international law trump personalities? Should there be a force to maintain international stability? Well, I can answer that last one faster, so I'll deal with that first. There was contemplated in 1945 an international standing force, which to be managed by the United Nations. And it was to be run, in fact, by the military, something called the Military Committee, which is one of the 6 organs in the UN Charter. But the Military Committee has never been functional. I wasn't born then, but I'm going to guess the reason why is no sovereign state was willing to surrender its sovereignty to a higher order armed force, except under Articles 51, 53, and Chapter 7 of the Charter. So, doesn't international law trump personality? Well, good question. And that brings in the issue of, well, how do we interpret international law? So if you and I are sitting in a Western liberal democracy, the answer is international law does trump personality. Personality is irrelevant. But if you're in Russia, you interpret international law differently. In the West, we'll say that we interpret international law through the lens of legal pragmatism. We respect international law, but from time to time, we may adopt a more assertive interpretation to protect our own interests. And that was very evident in the Nicaragua case in the mid-1980s, when the United States interpreted international law in its favor and just walked away. You may remember the Iran-Contra affair, and the United States took an unusually aggressive interpretation of international law and simply walked out of the courtroom where it was in with Nicaragua. On the other hand, Russia adopts an interpretation model called statism. And this harkens back to the whole historical narrative of Russia. Its existential crisis. Since the Mongols invaded Russia in 1333, Russia has never really recovered from its identity. Moreover, its track record in war fighting is not so good. It lost the Crimean War, lost the Cold War, it lost the Russo-Japanese War, it lost its war in Afghanistan. It's not doing too well. So because of that, international law has to be not set aside, but it has to be enveloped with personality. And I forget how Kagan phrases it, but I'll call it just a cult of personality. It was Stalin, then it was Khrushchev. And I guess this is the natural output of any autocratic system, where its leaders are it. Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping, two other examples. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I have a funny feeling there's a supplemental written question coming up. Article 2.4 prohibits the use of force. It does. However, this is subject to interpretation. Use of force, there has to be a threshold of use of force. Use of force in issues such as countermeasures is not considered the use of force. And while the Vienna Convention Law Treaty says there should be a sort of a working interpretation of ordinary English, the United States is a great example of saying, well, we'll use of force up to a particular level, but we won't call it use of force. We'll call it countermeasures, or we'll call it sort of armed incidents not amounting to use of force. And this is the way of diplomacy, for better or for worse. Remember who you're doing business with. You're doing business with sovereign states who will interpret law any way they see fit. Invasion is the use of force. Without consequence, international law has no teeth. Invasion is a use of force unless the invader is going to argue that there is an imminent threat. So, question that somebody else asked earlier, Tony, I think, raised a question: is the presence of NATO on the southern border of the Ukraine an imminent threat? In which case, invasion is a use of force, but it's permitted under Article 51. I'm weaving through the question because that's how the lawyers and the diplomats do it. There is no absolute right or wrong answer. And without consequence, international law has no teeth. Begs the question, well, if there were teeth, where would it come from? And the answer, one of those answers may be, well, teeth is to be found in sanctions. Now is not the time to start talking about sanctions, but that would be a superb, absolutely brilliant topic for another RAUSI seminar on security and defense. Because somebody told me the other day, I forget who, but it's a good friend of mine. His first name is Robert. Forget the guy's last name. But he said he didn't think sanctions were all that effective. I'm not sure I agree with him. But those are the grounds for a follow-on seminar. And now I will look to you for being the speaker at that seminar.
I want to thank Joe for a great presentation and the audience for a very engaging discussion. I know many will think differently now about how they define security and defense related to a number of topics in the future. So ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the formal part of the evening. A couple of notes about RAUSI future events. Please take note that we will continue our speaker series on February the 24th and March 24th, both at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Additionally, a quick reminder for those who are not members, please support RAUSI by becoming a member using the promotion code, which was on your screen prior to the presentation tonight. Follow all our details on the website, rausi.ca. Thank you all for attending tonight and enjoy the rest of your evening.